And the first branch is called cellular or cell-mediated immunity. Cellular or cell-mediated immunity. Okay, and this is going to be your T cells. You've probably heard of T cells. They're also called T lymphocytes. That's the exact same thing. T cells, T lymphocytes. And remember, a lymphocyte is a white blood cell that resides in the lymph. Okay, so again, the white blood cells are created in the bone marrow. That's where they're created. And then the T cells mature in the thymus. So that's why they're T cells. They mature in the thymus. And in a little bit we'll get to the B cells, which mature in the bone marrow. So that's why they're B cells. But the T cells mature in the thymus, and then they reside in the lymphatic tissue. So they move, first they were born in the bone marrow, then they grow up in the thymus, and then when they're mature, then they move out and they move to the lymphatic tissue. But they are able to leave the lymphatic tissue. So they can enter the blood, or they can enter the extracellular matrix. So the outside of the tissue, outside of the cells, they can kind of move to different spaces. So after a T cell is exposed to an antigen-presenting cell, so remember our antigen-presenting cells were our macrophages, and then we'll learn in a little bit that they're also B cells. So we had macrophages. Actually, we also had dendritic cells, macrophages and dendritic cells. And then we have B cells coming up. But after they are exposed to those antigens, then they begin to produce more cells. And the cells that they produce are the helper T cells, the killer T cells, the regulatory T cells, and the memory T cells. So, like I said, before, when they're developing their game plan, they are presented with this antigen and they're like, okay, what do we got to do? So every time they're presented with an antigen, they don't necessarily make all 4 types of cells. They're going to pick and choose based on what they need to do. So they're going to make one or more of these different cells. So the helper T cells, those cells are responsible for regulation, for the coordination of the attack, and for growth of other immune cells. So they're kind of the ones, the brains of the operation. So they're kind of thinking about, okay, what do we need to do? And then they're also helping all these other cells to kind of grow. So, I kind of think of them as like the trainers, like they come up with this plan, maybe like a coach. They come up with a plan, and then they're going to train their guys. Okay, so they look at, what they're faced with. Okay, we're going to do this, but we need these guys in shape over here, and we've got to get these guys in shape over here. So then the next cells that they make are the killer T cells. Sometimes these are cytotoxic T cells. Sometimes they're called that. The killer T cells, they target cells with antigens on the surface, cells that are infected with viruses, bacteria, or parasites, or cancerous cells. And these cells have direct interaction with the pathogens. So these killer T cells just go right at them. They're going to go to those cells, find the cells, destroy them. The regulatory T cells, sometimes these are called suppressor T cells. And regulatory, they're going to regulate, and they're going to shut down immune response after the invaders have been destroyed. So that way, the regulatory T cells are what kind of helps prevent autoimmunity. So, if we just let them keep going, we'd get into a situation where they would just keep destroying, and eventually they would destroy us. So this is the regulatory T cells, say, hey, battle's over. Let's stop and go home now. Okay, and then we have the memory T cells. And the memory T cells, they are responsible for remembering, memorizing previous antigens that activated their parent T cells. So remember the T cells when they were presented the antigen, and then they go and make 4 different types of cells. Okay, whatever it was that caused that T cell to make these cells, including the memory cell, then that memory cell, which is the child, is going to remember. Okay, so it's kind of like, hey, my dad was, faced with this antigen, so I've got to remember what it is, and I've got to be on the lookout for it the rest of my life. So those memory T cells will remember that antigen, and if they come across it again, then once they recognize that antigen, they quickly convert to an effector T cell. So this is really interesting. So the memory T cell remembers what it is for future immunity, and once they recognize it, then they can change into whatever cell they need to be, which they can become a helper cell, a killer cell, or a regulatory cell. So really neat. So they're remembering, but then when they're faced with that danger and they confront this antigen again, then they get to change into whatever cell is needed. So if they need another killer cell, then boom, they turn into a killer cell. So really neat how that works.